You're listening to an Airwave Media Podcast.
Uncle Henry sat on the doorstep and looked anxiously at the sky, which was even grayer than usual. Dorothy stood in the door with Toto in her arms and looked at the sky too. Aunt Em was washing the dishes. From the far north they heard a low wail of the wind. Uncle Henry and Dorothy could see where the long grass bowed in waves before the coming storm. There now came a sharp whistling in the air. "There's a cyclone coming, Em," he called to his wife. "I'll go look after the stock." Then he ran towards the sheds where the cows and the horses were kept. Aunt Em dropped her work and came to the door. "Quick, Dorothy," she screamed. "Run for the cellar." Then a strange thing happened. The house whirled around 2 or 3 times and rose slowly through the air. Dorothy felt as if she were going up in a balloon. The north and south winds met where the house stood and made it the exact center of the cyclone. In the middle of a cyclone, the air is generally still, but the great pressure of the wind on every side of the house raised it higher and higher until it was at the very top of the cyclone. And there it remained, and was carried miles and miles away, as easily as you could carry a feather. Excuse the people of the time when Frank Baum was writing these words, that he didn't know yet would become famous. You can't excuse their emotions if they too felt like they were in a cyclone. The decade starts with a severe economic shock. There's even a popular book that depicts that economic crash as a cyclone. Upending the farmer, upending the industrial worker. And with that force, new ideas would be reckoned with. Railroads would be under great scrutiny. Farmers would be in open revolt in the States. Unemployment, roaming armies of jobless men as policy leaned east toward banks, manufacturing companies. Prairie Populists won 4 states in the last presidential election, several congressional seats, couple of Senate seats, several governors. And politicians would do more than watch. Prior to making his historic speech, he sucked on a ripe lemon. He'd need his voice for this one. He'd need to hit the rafters. Probably his one shot. This, or maybe out of politics. He gave up his House seat. He lost the Senate race and was ineffective in Congress thus far. The current president didn't like him. So the lemon it was. The big party convention in Chicago, 1896, a convention, a group of people in one place, one time, ostensibly undecided about who they will pick. It could be like an animal, this collective being. This speaker would say years later about his own moment. The party had a choice, probably. Richard Bland of Missouri, a sensible legislator with lots of experience in Congress, would take up the banner. In a normal time, Bland would be the choice. This wasn't a normal time. The country was jolted by a depression, and not a small one. And the Democrats meeting this year in a state headed up by a radical governor, some felt, wanted to grab some of that support. Young William Jennings Bryan had just moved to his home state of Nebraska 9 years before, developed a good reputation there as a lawyer, and got to Congress, representing Lincoln, Nebraska. It was a good time. The population of Nebraska was increasing rapidly in the 19th century, fastest growing state in the country up to this time. His own election in the state that had sent Republicans previously showed the changing of the West. And Bryan, a Democrat, like so many American candidates before and since, thought he had the stuff to be the leader, not just supporting someone else, when Bryan was concentrating on tariff issues. Leading Democrat Joseph Bailey of Texas told Bryan, tariff, that's important, but it's about falling prices. And it's related to the currency question. That's the issue. Thus directed, Bryan poured into it, learned everything he could about silver and gold and politics. He wrote articles for the Omaha World that went all over the country. He became one of the key spokespeople for the silver movement. He benefited a lot from a pamphlet that went around the country that mostly made the point that the people were being denied one thing, and that was diversity in the metals used in the currency. That was keeping farmers down, that were keeping prices up, that were keeping the banks winning. Like any book that captures the imagination of people, it was controversial, but Bryan seized upon it. His own party's president was a gold-bug Democrat. But at this convention, it had already happened in the early primaries. The delegates that were going to this convention, it was already decided. The silver issue would be one on the table. Their own party's president was not welcome at this convention. Atgeld, the governor of Illinois, who years before released a group of working men in the Haymarket riots, some considered him a hero, others considered him a scourge, didn't necessarily like William Jennings Bryan, thought he was too young, too green, sounded like a preacher sometimes when he spoke, didn't think Nebraska was a good state to launch from, had a couple other candidates. But the Silverites, as they were called, they were in control of this convention. And they had made sure that the current president, Grover Cleveland, it was known, was not welcome here. David Hill, governor of New York, an Easterner, was not smiling, and a reporter noticed it. "I never smile at a funeral," he told a reporter. Silverites in the West and the South, if you added the populist vote scored in the 1892 election while Grover Cleveland was winning that election, plus the Silver Western Republicans who were so committed to the silver issue, with the right candidate they'd join, plus the Democratic Party, the majority issue is silver, you could win. A lot of people are going to tell the story of William Jennings Bryan and say he gets up and makes a speech about his candidacy for the presidency and wows everybody. But that's not actually what this speech is about. It's actually a platform plank about the silver issue and about setting federal policy to fix the value of silver currency, 16 to 1 of gold, and to make the coinage of silver unlimited, and to be opposed to what was called monometallism. This platform plank needed to be voted on. The votes were probably there in the hall. It was going to be preaching to the choir, but it needed to be advocated for, and there would be speakers against. This is where William Jennings Bryan is called to speak to this convention. It's not anything to do with himself or running for president. However, he does have a national following, and he makes sure those people are in attendance, and they've brought other people, other delegates, and everybody's ready. The lemon is tossed aside. William Jennings Bryan mounts the platform, not running for president, defending the party's majority draft platform. Because of the articles that he's written on this silver issue, there are cheers as soon as he gets up. They knew him, but most have not heard the sound of his voice, only his typewritten words. That's about to change. There are bandanas thrown as he approaches the stage, red bandanas. I've come to speak to you today in defense of a cause as holy as the cause of liberty. Every word that he would make in this historic speech was planned for 4 months. The individual is but an atom. He is born, he lives, and he dies. But principle is eternal. He's turned this obscure economic policy anyone could have advocated for into a crusade. To those who attack silver policy as selfish, as hurting business, he says, your definition of what a businessman is too limited. The man who is employed for wages is just as much a businessman as his employer. The merchant at a crossroad, he said, the country lawyer, is just as much a businessman as the powerful metropolis attorney or the merchant of New York. By now when he speaks, he pauses at moments. Merchant of New York. And the audience fills the gaps with cheers. Miners, he says, miners, his language is rich, who descend into the bowels of the earth. Farmers who go off in the morning and toil in the day. Bryan is equating them to the man who merely bets on the market. Call it demagoguery. He knows it will be. It is called that. Bryan is not just throwing off red meat, but he's answering charges that will come to the silver platform's way. He attacks the governing philosophy for much of the late 19th century, one that we'd still see today. We'd call it trickle down. There are those who believe that if you will make the well-to-do prosperous, it will leak through to everyone else. He rejects it. He calls instead to make the masses prosperous. It will find its way up through every class that rests upon the average man. In the audience, many are shifting from, this is a good defender of our silver policy that was probably going to pass anyway, to, why aren't we running this guy? Ah, my friends, we say not one word against those who live upon the Atlantic coast, but those hardy pioneers who braved all the dangers of the wilderness, who have made the desert to blossom as the rose. Those pioneers away out there, rearing their children near to nature's heart, where they can mingle their voices with the voices of the birds out there, where they have erected schoolhouses for the education of their children, and churches where they praise their Creator, and the cemeteries where sleep the ashes of their dead, are as deserving of the consideration of this party as any people in the country. Bryan's intensity increases as he goes on. We have petitioned. Our petitions have been scorned. We have entreated. Our entreaties have been disregarded. We have begged, and we have been mocked when calamity came. The hall is shaking. There is no recording of William Jennings Bryan's speech. It was before such a recording could be made. He did actually record it as an older man.
We reply that the great cities rest upon our broad and fertile prairies. Burn down your cities and leave our farms, and your cities will spring up again as if by magic. But destroy our farms, and the grass will grow in the streets of every city of the country.
But now here he is 36. It is the issue of 1776 all over again. Our ancestors, but 3 million in numbers, had the courage to declare their political independence. See, it's powerful oratory, but it's not hypnotism. That's logic being applied here. Shall we now, as their descendants, when we have grown to 70 millions, declare that we are less dependent than our forefathers?
They will search the pages of history in vain to find a single instance where the common people of any land have ever declared themselves in favor of the gold standard. They can find where the holders of fixed investments have declared for a gold standard, but not where the masses have.
So we get to the last point, and this is the line that's remembered from the speech. It's a warning to the supporters of a hard gold money policy. Money backed by what's in the federal gold reserves and nothing more issued. We have the producing masses, he says to them. And he pauses. You shall not press down upon the brow of labor this crown of thorns. You shall not crucify mankind upon a cross of gold. And it's not just what he says. Bryan also acts it out. He bows his head. He puts his arms out when he says, cross of gold, as if he is on the cross. The audience waits for more. And gets silence. It's over. And they fill in the gap again, shouting, walloping, screaming his name, screaming for silver. For Eastern Democrats, Grover Cleveland and his bunch, it's over. Bryan has taken over the party. Everyone's talking about this speaker now. It's not immediate that Bryan then becomes nominated. It's the next day. And he loses the first 3 votes. But he leads the 4th, and he wins outright in the 5th. The Bryan bandwagon has begun, and Bryan will go 7 more times to his party's convention in his lifetime, and twice more he will be nominated by that party. He will change the party forever. Governor Acgold, who wanted a radical candidate, wanted a silver position, still finds the convention going in a way, in his home city, going in a way that he didn't want to go, with this Western guy who sounds like a preacher. What did he say, anyhow? He asks someone. There's no reason to belabor this and provide a spoiler alert or anything. We're lovers of history. We know the story here. William Jennings Bryan never became president. But it's worthwhile noting the Democrats get 1 million additional votes and a candidate that campaigns like never before, who's physically present in towns and cities, who puts his own body into what we'd now call swing states, mostly in the Midwest. They're a special railroad car and speaking everywhere. You know, if you lived in Ohio, Michigan, Minnesota, there was a decent chance you could see William Jennings Bryan if you really wanted to. We'll make a quick trip out east, but mostly this entire election of 1896 is fought in the heartland. He will indeed get the Populist nomination in 1896. He will indeed get the Silver Republican Conference to support him. Democratic Party has their first inkling of the modern ideology that they have today, a more progressive ideology on a host of issues. Republicans develop their position, stand pat, conservatism, basing their candidate in his home, appealing to normalcy, to business, and raising tons of money from those businesses to beat back this demagogue as they see it. There's no TV, but the nation is awash in posters, flyers, paid speakers. Bryan and Silver is a novel 1890s occurrence. But the base of it is in a populist movement. The Grangers, the Greenbacks, the Southern Farmers Alliance, the National Farmers Alliance, including the African American Farmers Alliance, the sharecroppers and farmers. A meeting in Florida, we discussed it, has already talked about these issues and defined them, what populists want. A shorter work week, banking changes, silver. A platform in Cincinnati in 1892 is established and the People's Party runs. It's easier to say populist than People's Party all the time. And they eke out their own existence separate from the Democrats, separate from the Republicans. James Weaver, a Union general from Iowa who gets that nomination. He's kind of a moderate. The party wants respectability to increase the money supply, to help farmers. Weaver doesn't win, but he got some states. He is the number 2 party in several southern states where normally Democrats would have say 80% of the vote. He's challenging that in Alabama. He's challenging that in Texas, slightly challenging it in Mississippi, Tennessee, North Carolina. There's a new option. And so one way to see the 1896 election and the way the story is normally told is William Jennings Bryan and his great crusade and his new way of campaigning. And that's all true. He's increasing the size of the tent of his party and trying to bring in populism into one of the two major parties. So Bryan, while this is radical for his time, is still partially responsible for the fact that there are two major parties. Because when a new issue starts and there's a third party, the two parties compete for who can pick up that third party. And in this election, it was the Democrats. But it was not enough. Bryan gets tripped up in battles over who's going to be his vice president between the two parties, the Populists and Democrats. They each pick different people. He couldn't patch up with Eastern Democrats. That, to me, is the key to the election. Bryan at one point swings east and tries to patch things up with the New York Democrats, a critical state in that election. And he can't do it. He can't do it. Economy got a little better. There's even something that occurs towards the end of the election where wheat prices rise without having enacted any silver policy. And Republicans point to that and say, what's so magic about this silver? But more to the point, he also got stuck with the bill of the Grover Cleveland presidency. And Cleveland's second non-consecutive term, a lot of people blamed him for that recession, right or wrong. And Bryan is a Democrat. Even if he's against Cleveland, he's a Democrat. In fact, one of the things to remember is Bryan, who's out there on the stump attacking Cleveland's gold policy as much as, attacking his own party's president on it, shares the president's same position when it comes to tariffs and protection. And the Republicans let him have it on that. That it's the protection policy as much as the gold policy that led to ruin. Republicans have this luxury of not having to attack their own party, but just attack Bryan. And then they can lump Cleveland in, or they can make Cleveland the hero, the martyr, McKinley will say things supportive of Cleveland when it comes to the gold policy. But it'll lump Cleveland and Bryan and all Democrats when it comes to the tariff issue or anti-protectionism. They don't want to protect American working jobs, American business. That's the key to the 1896 election. But one thing you must say, the Democratic Party will never be the same. Bryan's wing would be there for several decades. And really, it's the foundation of Woodrow Wilson's win. He doesn't get that nomination without Bryan. Bryan becomes his Secretary of State. And who's the biggest fan of Woodrow Wilson and who serves in his administration? Franklin Roosevelt. So, in a sense, by the time you get to the 1930s, so maybe 3 decades and a half after he makes this speech, Bryan's wing of the party really does win in a big way. And these policies that were demagoguery or seen that way are adopted in many ways. In fact, to even go farther than Bryan, Franklin Roosevelt just disregards the gold standard. Republicans in that 1896 also found a lesson, that there was a coalition that they could capture, a little bit less of a group of people and more of a group of influence. And that's Eastern Democrats, who for the first time in a while were going to vote Republican. That they could also turn out their base. We talk about silver and gold. In the 19th century, there's still going to be fights about that going into the early 20th. FDR is going to first take us off the gold standard, and you're going to see experimentation with that going forward to the point now where gold has very little to do with money today. It is a money. People do collect gold, but it's not tied in the way that we absolutely thought, or some absolutely thought had to be, in the way the winning party in 1896 absolutely thought it had to be. But actually, they didn't entirely think so. It was just the way the politics worked. We'll talk about that. But here's the important point. Silver and gold is not everything that the populist movement offered. It was just an easy symbol to grab onto. It's colorful.
Hi, it's Bruce. Listen, we all know the news headlines are full of wild stories, like how the world is tipping towards authoritarianism, all while somehow, simultaneously, freezing, flooding, and on fire. It's a lot to take in. But what if, instead of being on the brink of disaster, we're actually on the cusp of a better world? If I've got your attention, then I highly recommend tuning to a podcast that offers a weekly dose of optimistic ideas from smart people. What Could Go Right is the acclaimed news podcast from the Progress Network. Zachary Karabell and Emma Varvaloucas dive into the biggest news and most pressing topics of our time, from climate change to politics, and make the case for a brighter future. Season 5 features fascinating guests like democracy scholar Yesha Mounk on the hidden perils of identity politics, and NPR anchor Steve Inskeep about the importance of talking to people who differ from you, and what Abe Lincoln learned from those conversations that helped him unify the country. It's time to ditch the doom-scrolling polarization and start focusing on some of the things going right. So check out What Could Go Right wherever you listen to podcasts.
In fact, Henry Demers Lloyd, a writer, called it the cowbird of American politics, referring to a type of bird that waits for the nest to be built by the sacrifice of another bird and then takes over the nest for its own babies. Lloyd says of the silver and gold issues and of the silver rights, they waited till the nest had been built by the sacrifices of labor and others, and then laid its eggs in it, pushing out the others, which were smashed on the ground. We gotta watch when we tell this story. I like to tell it. I think it's an awesome story that this 30-year-old, came and took over a party, and nobody planned to elect him initially. And I think it'll always be a great story of politics. But not only was he not successful, you can look at that election and look at some of the states, and it's just like happens a lot. A couple more thousand votes in a few of these states. It flips to Bryan. He wins the Electoral College. But it was kind of known by the end that it would be lost because there was another side. Theodore Roosevelt, not yet on any ticket, called Bryan a small man, full of contemptuous pity, and Atgeld in fleecing covering. See, he was really afraid of Atgeld, who he thought was the real power. We can see the jaws of the wolf, Theodore Roosevelt declares. Atgeld had pardoned prisoners accused of throwing bombs at the Haymarket riots. Atgeld, he said, would connive wholesale murder and justify it by cunning sophistry. This was a common attack too. Bryan's just kind of a cover. It's just kind of the sheep, fleecy covering. So when you talk about populism, because it can get to issues of the downsides of democracy, because it can get to issues of demagoguery, perhaps a leader disguised as populism, right? Brings up all these issues, it becomes very complex. And it's just as complex to think about a story, very popular story, that comes right out of these times and with images from these political battles unmistakably. But it's just as confusing to try to find out what that author meant. And of course, I'm talking about The Wizard of Oz. So we focus a lot in 1896 on Bryan and not always on McKinley. If we do focus on McKinley at all, it's not for his political art, but because he spent so much money in the campaign. And he certainly did. One of the things that I believe happens is that if Bryan can open up political language and start using biblical metaphors, and, there's more than that. There's an entire passage in that Cross of Gold speech while he's talking about this noble idea of silver money, where he compares McKinley to Napoleon and say that the waves of St. Helena are starting to crest, saying he's making fun of his size in a little bit there, or just the fact that he's about to lose, that it turns out that McKinley's nominated on the anniversary of the Battle of Waterloo, something that might have been more on 19th century minds than 21st century minds. But if Bryan can amp up the political rhetoric, so can Republicans. And so you're going to hear in this campaign that they constantly assert that Bryan is un-American. And that probably wouldn't have been said about a major party candidate in the past, un-American. That, the idea, because he is wanting to redistribute wealth, and also his tariff policy where if you're in favor of low tariffs, that means, well, you're going to give away everything to other countries. McKinley often uses the word cheap, that silver proponents are going to make this country cheap. We don't want a cheap country. It belies that there's a whole range of compromises that McKinley actually, in his positions. Bryan is the one, in a sense, that encourages McKinley to be more for the gold standard. Because initially, the Republican Party is full of people who support the silver position. Seeing it as the Democrats were silver, the Republicans gold, would actually not be accurate. There are many people at the St. Louis Convention. Foraker, who's a former governor of Ohio, who is somebody that McKinley needs his support, is a silverite. And then there's a lot of positions in between. The current policy at the time is that you use some silver in the money and some gold. So one of the things that's going to happen, McKinley's very careful, and his campaign manager, Mark Hanna, very careful about what they say. Like in one document, in a platform document, they eliminate the word gold and just say the existing currency standard, where gold proponents want it to be the existing gold standard. And they do things like that, which are leading people to have some questions. Gold supporters weren't just seeing the world as them choking little people, choking farmers and workers, as in Bryan's rhetoric, and it's important to see their point of view. This from President McKinley, Robert Merry, who I had on the show. Gold advocates countered the call for more liquidity by noting that the nation's money supply had increased by 240% since 1860 and 104% since 1872, much faster than the rise in population. So there's more money growing faster than the population. Global gold production had increased substantially in previous years, bolstering the money through new supply. And they have their own publications, most notably The Nation, which has a series of articles, just a number of articles on free coinage, arguing that the price of wheat reflected supply and demand ratio, and wheat itself had nothing to do with the money supply, as Bryan and other advocates were saying. There's still holes in that argument. And not that this is to be a course in, currency economics, which I'm not qualified to do. But if your argument is that when new supplies of gold are found, the money supply will get better, that's great. And it's going to be prophetic because they're going to find that gold in Alaska during the 1890s. But how did they know that was going to happen? You are limited still, if you tie things to gold, to getting more gold supply. So it's one of the reasons why the money operates the way it does today, in a way that neither Bryan nor McKinley would like or advocated for, but something more modern. So we also have to talk about McKinley and his position, because as a relative Westerner, as an Ohio governor seeking the nomination, previous issue that he had taken a clear position on was tariffs. The McKinley tariff of 1890 had his name on it. Tariff raising bill, taxes on import, raising revenue for the government, protecting industries. It was a protectionist tariff, and he is for that position in 1896. It will be an issue on all posters. It's an American issue. It will be associated with the eagle, with the flag, protecting American industries. Here's what Bob Merry says about the run-up to the St. Louis Convention where McKinley will be nominated. As McKinley associates grappled with the issue, the basis of their discussion was a document crafted in Canton, McKinley's hometown, by him and others and hand-carried by Mark Hanna to St. Louis. The crucial elements of McKinley's draft stated that the party favored sound money unreservedly and opposed any effort to debase our currency or disturb our credit. The party was committed to maintaining all the money of the United States, whether gold, silver, or paper, at par with the best of money in the world. His position doesn't have an objection to silver as long as it could be maintained at parity with gold. And how they're going to do that? And this is a key to the Republican position. So it's not just like gold versus silver. They want an agreement with other countries to do the same. So we'll do bimetallism, gold and silver, if other countries will do it as well. Until then, it's the plain duty of the United States to maintain our present standard. As we get to the St. Louis Convention, Mark Hanna pulls off something masterful. He knows that Easterners are arriving and they want McKinley to be stronger on gold than he has. Henry Cabot Lodge, a brilliant but haughty Yankee with a romantic vision of America's destiny and a streak of dauntless intolerance, as one observer admiringly put it, arrived bent on forcing the word gold into the currency plank by whatever means necessary. On Monday, he marched into Hanna's office, and without any preliminary greeting, despite its being the first time the two men had met, announced, "Mr. Hanna, I insist on a positive declaration for a gold standard plank in the platform." Hanna looked up from his desk. "Who the hell are you?" "Senator Henry Cabot Lodge of Massachusetts." "Well, Senator Henry Cabot Lodge of Massachusetts," Hanna said, "you can go plumb to hell." "All right, sir. I will make my fight on the floor of the convention." That's what Lodge says. Maybe, I don't think Hanna consulted his client McKinley. So you have this really early example of what might happen between a consultant and a political client. I doubt that if Hanna asked McKinley's permission to say that to the very important senator from Massachusetts, he would have gotten it. But nonetheless, it's what Hanna does because he's got something in mind. It's precisely what Hanna wanted, Bob Murray writes. Convention rumors that the Eastern goldmen were marshaling their forces to take over the drafting of the currency plank. So it appears in newspapers that Easterners are insisting McKinley adopts this attitude. Here's what a Washington Post headline says: Hanna yields to Lodge. McKinley commits to a gold standard, but he does so with everybody knowing, or thinking that they know, that it's not really his position. It's been forced on him by Lodge, by Thomas Platt in New York, big boss there, by several other Easterners. The Western Silvermen, Bob Murray writes, might not like where the convention was going, but they couldn't blame the man in Canton, that's McKinley, who was widely viewed as more sympathetic to their interests than the convention seemed to be. Hanna later writes a friend, "The whole thing was managed in order to succeed in getting what we got, and that was my only interest." So he positions himself to be ready for a strong gold standard, and then once Bryan's nominated in the Democratic convention, McKinley can go all the way gold. But it really wasn't his position to start with, nor the position of the Democratic Party, of the Republican Party, and they still have this plank in there about seeking out international cooperation to perhaps get it to gold and silver. But as it turns out, McKinley will be the president. It won't happen until 1900. 1900, 4 years after Bryan's Cross of Gold speech. It's McKinley who is actually president and will take out a gold pen and sign the bill authorizing a gold standard in the United States money. It's incredible when you think about it. He very much did crucify everyone on a cross of gold, so to speak. But by then, the supply of money has increased, wheat prices are up, the economy's doing great. So the idea that, it's too evident then that the simple money equations don't work. The Wizard of Oz, which small businessman and editor Frank Baum was writing at this time, as we indicated, begins with a cyclone, and has images of gold and silver, of east and west, of lions and scarecrows, all used in political cartoons and statements at the time. It's important to remember, if you only have watched the movie and not seen the book, that Dorothy's slippers, red in the movie, are silver in the book, and she's walking on the yellow brick road. In the desk at his shop, we believe Baum had a model of a Tin Woodsman with an axe. Perhaps, and many people see, as a symbol. Here's the line in the book. They turned and walked through the first of a few steps when Dorothy discovered something shining in a ray of sunshine that fell between the trees. One of the big trees had been partially chopped through, and standing behind it, with an axe in his hands, was a man made entirely of tin. He's a man. Let's note that. He's not some kind of robot or something. He's a man, but he's made entirely of tin. Did you groan? Dorothy asks. Yes. I've been groaning for over a year, and no one has come to help me. Well, if you know the story, of course, he needs oil. He's rusting. And it's perhaps a symbol of industrial workmen. Now, it's important to say about the Wizard of Oz that it's gone over and over again. There's a professor in the 60s who comes up with a whole theory that every piece of the Wizard of Oz is tied to the politics of the day, that the lion represents Brian, that the wizard's McKinley, and things like that. That's been gone over a lot. And it's not so easy. Baum himself says it had nothing to do with politics. He was merely trying to create a modern nursery rhyme. And you can agree when you look at the time, and if you wanted to pull symbols that weren't, say, princes and frogs and things like that, but were modern symbols, that's what was available in magazines and cartoons of the time. Images like scarecrows and the Tin Man in a form, He either used OZ as an ounce of gold, or his file cabinet drawer had an O to Z file. His son says his father was a populist, but that was his youngest son and perhaps too young to know. Baum always insisted there was no politics. He had been an editor. His newspaper articles contained some accounts of populism, but also some poems and other things that were supportive of McKinley. I tend to believe it's just kind of common imagery, and if anything, it's a mix of both, making fun of sort of both approaches. But in this, yes, I've been groaning for a year, no one's come to help me. Even if Baum didn't intend it, people read into that symbolism of the industrial worker, and it's kind of true, because the one thing Brian couldn't get is that industrial worker to join his crusade. They mostly vote with the Republicans at this time. Brian's becomes a farmer crusade, and it's not till later that you're going to build that coalition of industrial workers and farmers together to vote Democrat. And that coalition has been fractured and split and reorganized since then in a lot of different ways. Oil my neck first, the Tin Man says. Then the joints in my arms. And when he receives the oil, the Tin Woodman says, this is a great comfort. I have been holding that axe in the air ever since I rusted. So, what is it? Is it a symbol of the industrial worker or the unemployed worker who's now employed? I think there's all of these things. Even if he's not intending to be political, it's in there. I don't think we'll ever know. Coxey's army that was launched with so much promise and so much enthusiasm and press coverage, and reaches Pittsburgh. There's a lot of support. The authorities in Pittsburgh are a little scared of this wandering army. They cordon them off into one park and eventually don't allow visitors to come see them, or only in small groups. Carl Brown, one of Coxey's sergeants in the army, says, they have penned up our men like cattle. But there's help, and there's people reaching out. A Pittsburgh firm provided 500 pairs of shoes for Coxey's army. Here's what a Pittsburgh paper says. Laugh and scoff at the Coxey movement, as many do, and more wish they could. The scene on the Monongahela Wharf would convince any but the thoughtless that these be times of unrest and discontent with the prevalent social condition. When they march away from Pittsburgh, they're met by a cornet band saluting the army as it marches towards Washington. And a side note, there's a fellow that's with Coxey's army who, when asked what his name is by some of the reporters, he just says, "I'm unknown." And he's then called the Great Unknown, and he makes a thing out of it. And he advocates various positions. He's quoted in papers, but he never says his name. And eventually, he tries to take over as second in command at Coxey's army, but Coxey intervenes and sends the Great Unknown away. He'll arrive at a Maryland farm right outside. A smaller group, not the entire army, of several hundred, will approach the Capitol, attempt to go on the lawn, and they will be attacked, beaten by Capitol Police. Coxey himself will be arrested and fined for trespassing. That ends Coxey's movement temporarily. He will be back in 1914, and this time he'll be invited to speak.
So you get this passage in The Wizard of Oz, and it's like they finally meet Oz, sends for Dorothy, and he says, "Sit down, my dear. I think I found the way for you to get out of this country." "And back to Kansas?" "Well, I'm not sure about Kansas, for I haven't the faintest notion which way it lies. But the first thing to do is cross the desert, and then it should be easy to find your home." "How can I cross the desert?" "Well, I'll tell you what I think," said the little man. "You see, when I came to this country, it was in a balloon. You came through the air, being carried by a cyclone. So I believe the best way to get across the desert will be through the air. Now, it's quite beyond my powers to make a cyclone, but I've been thinking the matter over, and I believe I can make a balloon." "How?" said Dorothy. "A balloon," said Oz, "is made of silk, which is coated with glue to keep the gas in it. I have plenty of silk in the palace, so it'll be no trouble to make the balloon. But in all this country, there's no gas." "It won't float?" remarked Dorothy. "It will be of no use to us." "True," answered Oz, "but there's another way to make it float, which is to fill it with hot air. Hot air isn't as good as gas, for if the air should get cold, the balloon would come down to the desert. Are you coming with me?" he asked. "Yes, I'm tired of being a humbug. If I should go out of this palace, people would discover I'm not a wizard, and then they would be vexed with me." Oz sent word to his people that he was going to make a visit to his great brother Wizard, who lived in the clouds. Oz ordered the balloon carried in front of the palace, and the people gazed upon it. The Tin Woodman had chopped a big pile of wood, and now he made a fire, and Oz held the bottom of the balloon over the fire so that the hot air that arose would be caught in the silken bag. So essentially what you have is Oz in this balloon, and he flies away, and it to me, the metaphor of hot air as a politician talking, useless person going to this palace to seek out solutions for someone else to solve your problems, puts Baum a little more on the kind of bootstrap side of politics than the traditional populist side. I mean, both elements are there. So I do think that he is kind of just pulling from a lot of what's there to make a nursery rhyme and to have cool things happen. But in there's a little bit of a lesson. Like, don't go to this humbug politician with his hot air to get things.
I want to thank you for listening. The website is www.myhistorycanbeatupyourpolitics.com. We've got a Patreon there. This is part 2. We've got part 3 and 4 coming up. I want to thank you for listening.